Good morning. This is Keisha Peterkin, the secretary to the committee. Ms. Alfred, are you all hearing me? Ministry of Labor.
Good morning, all, and I would like to welcome to the 19th meeting of the Joint Select Committee of Human Rights, Equality and Diversity. The committee's public hearing into what we hope to anticipate will be a very fruitful discussion this morning is an inquiry into the equality in the workplace, the impact of gender on the parity of work and opportunity. Members of the listening public and viewing public are invited to post or send their comments and questions to us via social media on our several platforms of the Parliament: Facebook, Parview, Parliament, YouTube channel, and Twitter. I would like to note the presence of representatives from the Ministry of Labor, from the following entities: the Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Public Administration, Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs Division, the EOC, the Equal Opportunities Commission, the Joint Trade Union Movement, and the Trinidad and Tobago Coalition of Services Industries. I would ask in that order that individuals from Ministry of Labor, followed by Public Administration, introduce themselves and their teams.
Good morning. I am Loris Alfred, Acting Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Labor.
Good morning. Rosemary Witzia, Director, International Affairs.
Good morning. Sanika Tyson, Senior Legal Officer.
Good morning. I'm Justin Joseph, Labor Market Specialist.
Office of the Prime Minister.
Maya, Permanent Secretary, Office of the Prime Minister.
Shalian Hart, Director, Gender Affairs Division.
McCandle Caesar, Senior Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist.
The EOC.
Sorry, good morning. I am Haran Ramkaran Singh, Director, Legal Services.
Good morning. Maria Rodriguez Fields, Senior Legal Officer.
Attendance from the Joint Trade Union Movement.
Good morning. I am Trevor Johnson, Assistant General Secretary. My two colleagues will introduce themselves.
Good morning. Cassandra Tommy Darbro, General Secretary of Amalgamated Workers Union.
Good morning, everyone. I am Sharon Lacan King, Second Vice President of the Trinidad and Tobago National Nursing Association.
And the TTCSI.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Joseph, President. My two team members will introduce, and I'll start with my director.
Yes, good morning, Ramon Gregorio, Director, TTCSI.
Mr. Lee Singh, you're on mute.
Good morning, Darren Lee Singh, CEO of the TTCSI. Morning, Chairman.
Good morning. I am Dr. Muhammad Yunus Ibrahim.
Chairman, Public Administration is also here.
Go ahead, from Public Administration.
Good morning, Chair and members. I am Claudel McKellar, Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Public Administration, and I have my two colleagues with me.
Good morning, Alicia Wellington, Director, Human Resources.
Good morning, Technical Police Room, Senior Legal Officer.
Is that all the members in your room?
Yes, Chair.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Dr. Muhammad Yunus Ibrahim. I'm the chairman of this Committee, Human Rights, Equality and Diversity. And I ask that the members present, starting with those who are here with me, introduce themselves.
Good morning. My name is Kazim Hussein, member.
Good morning. My name is Helan Francis, member.
Good morning, Anita Haynes Allen, member.
Good morning, Shamfa Kojo Lewis, member.
Good morning, everyone. Esmond Ford, member.
Ms. John?
Yes, Chairman. Good morning, Jillian John, member.
Thank you. I would just like to remind all that the objective of this inquiry is to examine the parity between genders with respect to 4 parameters: remuneration, conditions of work, opportunities for promotion, and safety and a safe and healthy work environment. I would like to ask Mr. Kurt Mayer to give us a 2 to 3 minute introduction and opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Chairman and esteemed members of the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Equality and Diversity, and all stakeholders joining us today. The Office of the Prime Minister welcomes this critical inquiry into the equality in the workplace, the impact of gender on parity of work opportunity. The Gender and Child Affairs Vision remains steadfast in advancing gender equity and gender justice through the integration of gender considerations into all government policies, programs, and projects. We look forward to today's discussion and recommendations of this committee as we chart the way forward on this issue. Thank you.
Now we would like to have a brief 2 minute introduction by the PS of the Ministry of Labour.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. The Ministry of Labour is grateful for the opportunity to participate in this inquiry into equality in the workplace and the impact of gender on the parity of work opportunity. The ministry's mandate focuses on decent work, industrial peace, and opportunity for all. This aligns directly with Goal 5 on gender equality and Goal 8 on decent work and economic growth of the Sustainable Development Goals. The promotion of decent work, which can be defined as productive, adequately remunerated work performed under conditions of freedom, equity, safety, and human dignity, has gender equality as an integral element. Differences and inequalities between women and men and discrimination of any type are obstacles that need to be overcome in order to achieve decent work for all. In the pursuit of decent work and gender equality, Trinidad and Tobago has ratified ILO Convention number 111 on discrimination, employment and occupation in 1970, ratified in ILO Convention number 100 on Equal Remuneration in 1997 and implemented the National Workplace Policy on Sexual Harassment. Further, all of the ministry's services are intended to foster decent working conditions. Specific activities being undertaken by the Ministry of Labour to promote equal opportunities in the world of work for men and women include modernization of labor laws in keeping with international labor standards, strengthening of the enforcement arms of the ministry to promote adherence to the provision of our labor laws, collection and analysis of gender disaggregated labor market data to assist in evidence-informed policy and decision-making, and promoting awareness of rights and responsibilities in the workplace to both employees and employers. As I close, Mr. Chairman, the Ministry of Labour is ready to assist the Joint Select Committee in its deliberations, and we look forward to an informative and productive session. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Can we hear from Mr. Claudel McKellar, PS of the Ministry of Public Administration?
Good morning, Chair and members. Thank you for inviting the Ministry of Public Administration to provide written responses and to participate in the committee's inquiry into equality in the workplace, the impact of gender on the parity of work opportunity. The Ministry of Public Administration, being focused on public service modernization and transformation, is cognizant of the importance of equality in the workplace and the impact of gender on the parity of work opportunities as it relates to organizational wellness and good industrial relations practices. Chair, I wish to assure you and the members of the committee that my team and I undertake to support the committee's inquiry by responding to your questions to the best of our ability and providing subsequently any additional information that may be required. We also welcome any recommendations that this committee may subsequently proffer towards equal opportunity and parity between the genders. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have a brief introduction from Mr. Haran Ramkaran Singh?
Yes. Good morning, Chairman and members and fellow stakeholders. Very briefly, the Equal Opportunity Commission is a statutory body created by an Act of Parliament, the Equal Opportunity Act, and one of its mandates is to receive, investigate, to treat with complaints of discrimination that members of the public can bring before it. One of the grounds of complaints that we can deal with is complaints on the grounds of sex. So, for example, we can deal with complaints, and we have dealt with complaints of persons who say that they're discriminated in their employment on the grounds of sex. I just wanted to stick a pin. You know, normally when we think about sex discrimination, we think about, for example, is a woman being paid less than a man for doing the same job? But I just also want to draw to your attention that it can work both ways. There were cases, for example, from the United Kingdom, where with respect to retirement ages, where, for example, if a woman was allowed to retire at 60, but a man had to work until 65, that was held to be sex discrimination against a man. So that the short point I wanted to make is that when we think about gender parity and gender issues, I would like us to think about, if possible, to not just to look at it purely as men discriminating against women, but whether there is equality, whether, for example, men are subjected to greater detriments in certain areas than women. Our remit is to investigate these complaints, where possible, conciliate it. That is to say, we bring the parties to the table to have a conversation to see if it can be resolved. And if it cannot be resolved, the Equal Opportunity Act created a second institution, which is the Equal Opportunity Tribunal, and they are a court of law. They are independent from us, and their mandate is to hear and determine the case and render a judgment as the case may be. And so that, in a nutshell, is what the work of the Equal Opportunity Commission. To some extent, you may say it is a bit reactive in that we are complaint-based. Someone has to lodge a complaint with us first and foremost. That said, we do have proactive duties in terms of public education, engagement, and awareness. Mr. Chairman, for example, being invited before this committee is a form of our public engagement, and we are grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we hear from Mr. Trevor Johnson, the Assistant General Secretary of CHITUM?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good morning to members of this session. Mr. Chairman, we are grateful to be present at this session because the joint trade union movement, from a labor perspective, of course, we would have been looking at, and we have to deal with all of these issues on a daily basis, whether it be the issue of remuneration, which might be, there may be challenges in that, whether it be looking at conditions of work, or even a safe and healthy working environment. Even in that regard, for example, we have challenges, or we see challenges where, you have issues between men and women in terms of provision of the appropriate facilities. And you look at things like, pregnant women, nursing mothers, whether there are appropriate facilities provided for them, etc. So there are a whole number of issues, promotion opportunities. We still seem to operate in an environment in Trinidad and Tobago where the number, for example, CEOs by far, men outstrip in significant numbers the number of women who are in top positions in organizations. It's changing a bit in the public sector, but there's still within the private sector still significant disparities. So these are areas that we would be happy to discuss and look at how we go forward. And the members with me of the Joint Trade Union Movement would certainly welcome the reflections of the deliberations of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Can we now hear from the President of the Trinidad and Tobago Coalition Services and Industries?
Thank you.
Diane
Good morning,
Joseph.
everyone, again. Thank you very much. Chair, let me say that we are indeed happy to be here this morning to discuss the topics as outlined earlier. The TTCSI supports the idea of equity in the workplace and on both ends, male and female. And we believe that it is not something that is vastly troublesome within the sector. However, we are here to listen and to participate and to support fully. Let me advise as well that on behalf of the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs, we did conduct a survey in April of last year. However, based on the publication, which predates the time of the current board, the responses were just 13 organizations. A report was done on it, but we believe given the size of the membership of the TTCSI at the time, which was 72, the response we consider to be insufficient to properly analyze the feedback on this. And we propose to redo that survey following discussions and what may come out of this very important session today. So we are here to support fully and to assist in taking this process forward.
Thank you very much, Ms. Joseph. I'd just like to remind committee members and officials to direct their questions when we commence through the chair. And I would just like to remind you all, we are all a bit rusty with online meetings a bit being regular, and activate the microphone when you're speaking and kindly go to mute. And just remember there's a raise hand feature. Mr. Johnson, that yellow thing behind you makes me look as though your hand is up, but it's okay. I know it comes up in a different part of the screen. I would like to proceed by opening with a question to the TTCSI. Although we just heard from you last, you did say that you did a survey last April. However, can you, for the purpose of and the benefit of the listening community and the public, can you expand and to extend to us what is the overview of your organization and what are some of the services provided by the TTCSI?
The Trinidad and Tobago Coalition of Services Industries is the umbrella association for the services sector in Trinidad and Tobago. Our core functions include advocacy, lobbying, and capacity building for and on behalf of the services sector. The survey was done at the request of the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs, as it relates to the gender wage gap in the private sector of Trinidad and Tobago. The request, based on my understanding at the time by the previous board, was for support in terms of the provision of information. It was circulated on April 29th, and the closing date was May 1st. So we are of the opinion that that four-day gap was not sufficient, and maybe hence the reason that we only had 13 organizations or associations submitting feedback. And we are of the opinion, out of a membership at the time of 72 associations, this survey, as important as it is, should really be for a longer period of time and information coming in from a wider cross-section of our membership.
So, based on a newspaper article dated May 9th, 2024, would that feed into your last survey or post?
It was post.
It was post, okay.
Yes, it was a newspaper publication in May, and
Correct.
it was post. Yes.
So, apart from that survey that was conducted, which, like you said, was seemed upon respondents, but we're now understanding it may have been a limited respondents, in your opinion.
It is.
Yeah.
Yes.
The perception on whether there's a gender wage gap, was there any research conducted by the TTCSI to compare similar jobs by both men and women to establish an informed conclusion that there is indeed a gap between male and female in the private sector?
Chair, this was the first of its kind for the TTCSI, the one that I'm speaking to now. And following the publication of this, we were called to this committee, and the board, the new board that is, felt that we should attend this meeting, hear what is coming out of it, and then design a survey that may be more appropriate and with a lengthy period of time, or a longer period of time as compared to the last one, where we can get responses that may give us a more informed position or feedback on a matter as important as this.
Okay, so you're hoping for a more holistic and a wider feedback from the community and from your interest bodies. But what parameters would you be framing your expanded survey on?
I would like to pass that to our director responsible for research, who we consider as the expert on our team, Mr. Gregorio.
Yes, good morning, Chair, and good morning, everyone again. Yeah, so, Chair, what we envisage will undertake would be to talk to a wider cross-section of players in the space. So, for example, we have the Office of the Prime Minister, Ministry of Labour, EOC, the trade union movement, and our intent is to consult with them and develop a broader methodology that really encapsulates all the areas as it relates to the gender pay equality. Of course, some of the main themes would be workplace equality, education and access, social attitudes and cultural norms, health and well-being, of course, legal rights and gender equality, political representation and participation, economic empowerment, intersectionality, public policies, and as well as global perspectives. So, as my president had mentioned, the survey in itself, the one that this new board would have encountered upon entering office, we felt that it was inadequate in a number of different areas, and as such, if we have the benefit of wider consultation, we'll be able to put together a more rigorous methodology that encapsulates a mixed method, potentially quantitative and qualitative research that will lend to a more holistic perspective that we could now make strong evidence-based statements on.
Thank you. I'd like to shift the questioning to the Ministry of Labour. And I would like to ask, as it's a bit of a lengthy ask here, that in a survey done for 2016, it was noted that the wage gap between male and female workers in the government, service, and state enterprises. There was for the periods of 2016 to 2022, it was significantly high. In fact, the data suggests, quoted from the CSO, revealed that males were earning 27% more than their female colleagues in state enterprises. The variance between male and female workers in the government, public service, and statutory boards was relatively lower to that of both the private sector and government state enterprises. The data showed that the average wage gap from 2016 to 2019 for employees in the government, public service, and statutory boards was 6%, indicating that males earned an average of 6% more than their female counterparts. Now, that was then. However, from 2020 to 2022, the data showed a reversal in the trend, with females earning 3% more than the male counterparts. This is according to your submission. And my question is, given the discrepancies in the wage between male and female employees, how are the terms and conditions of persons employed at state enterprises handled?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chairman. Your question in terms of terms and conditions for persons employed in the state sector is not one under the purview of the Ministry of Labour. Terms and conditions are handled by the Personnel Department Office of the CPO. So we are not in a position to respond to that question at the moment.
Very well. I will redirect that question. However, to see this level of turnover, as in the differences in the gender wage be higher in favor of males over females, and then there was post 2020 to 2022 a noticeable shift in one of the categories, where it is now that it has been reported by the CSO that it is in favor by as much as 3% of females over males. We must now direct ourselves to the working documents and the policies of the Ministry of Labour. And yes.
So Chair, thank you again. So let me hand you over to our Labour Market Information Specialist, who would give you more insight into the information we would have provided. Mr. Joseph.
Okay, good morning, Chair. Before I answer the question, I just want to clarify the definition for gender wage gap. There are two types of gender wage gaps: unadjusted gender wage gap, which measures the average differences in pay between men and women, and there is the adjusted gender wage gap, which measures the differences in pay between men and women, accounting for factors that determine pay, such as job roles, education, and experience. So the adjusted gender wage gap looks at equal work for equal pay. Based on the information presented, we looked at the unadjusted wage gap. So if the values favor men, this suggests that in the upper end of the organization or top management, there are more men employed. Whereas if it favors women, it suggests that more women are employed in the upper levels of the organization. So it does not mean that men and women are earning different pay for the same job. It simply means that more men or more women are employed in the upper end. If you take the public service, for example, in most of the ministries, the permanent secretaries are female. Therefore, the information will favor women. It will show a value that favors women, which suggests that there's a gender wage gap in the public service that favors women at the managerial level.
Okay, so you've walked us through the different permutations of the rationale and the reason between the different types of gender wage gaps. I was referring to a study done before while I was trying to bring up the policy of the Ministry of Labor, and I would like to refer to a study done in 2015 by Reshma Mahabir and Dindya Ramratan entitled The Influences of Gender Wage Gap, where the authors revealed significant wage disparities between male and female workers in Trinidad and Tobago, especially in the private sector. The authors recommended the need for a gender-sensitive employment policy. It was mentioned that the Ministry of Labor has submitted to the Industrial Relations Advisory Committee a list of policy prescriptions, one of which is equal pay for work of equal value. I would like to ask you, what is the current status of the policy?
Good morning, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I would put you on to my senior legal officer.
Yes. Good morning, Chair. The Industrial Relations Advisory Committee, which was established under Section 80 of the Industrial Relations Act, was tasked with the responsibility of developing employment standards legislation, which would seek to establish minimum or basic terms and conditions of work in accordance with international labor standards. And that will be applicable to all employees, men and women, in the workplace. Currently, the policy prescriptions supposed to be incorporated into the legislation include, as you stated, principles whereby equal pay for work of equal value for men and women within Trinidad and Tobago. Currently, the Industrial Relations Advisory Committee has completed its review of that policy, and it was submitted to the Honorable Minister of Labor for approval.
Ms. Haynes, your hand is up. Member Haynes.
Thank you. Good morning again. Chairman, through you, if you would allow me. My question is to the Ministry of Public Administration. Given that our committee is looking at the impact of gender on the parity of work opportunity, and that the public sector is the largest employer in Trinidad and Tobago, and the mission of the Ministry of Public Administration is to work with its stakeholders to develop policies, to strengthen the workforce, as well as providing things like safe work accommodations, etc. So given your overall mandate of creating an enabling environment for the public sector, my first question is, to what extent, in terms of determining your policies and the strategic objectives of the Ministry of Public Administration, to what extent is gender a consideration in determination of those policies? So I'll start there, and based on your response, I'll continue.
Good morning again, Chair. Through you, I'll respond to the member's question. Thank you for that question. Yes, the role, the remit of the Ministry of Public Administration includes working with our fellow ministries and departments in the public service to develop policies that strengthen and enhance public administration. In so doing, there is some consideration to gender issues, but I'll preface that by saying that essentially we deal with jobs, we deal with positions. We don't necessarily emphasize gender considerations. But having said that, we do recognize that there are different genders, male and female, within the workplace. So that, for example, in our outfitting policies developed by the ministry through its Property and Real Estate Services Division, there would be considerations, for example, proper toilet facilities for lactating mothers, to attend to that when it comes into place, issues related to sick days. So there is consideration, but it's not a dominant consideration, given that we deal in a work environment where essentially we treat with parity, equal work, equal pay.
Thank you. And so the reason I raised that, Chair, if I can continue, I believe it was Mr. Johnson from GTM who would have raised it in the opening statement. And when we're looking at, when we're discussing parity in the workplace, we're talking more of equity than equality, than straight equality. And if we're looking at a question, I think Ministry of Labor raised it in certain instances where you look at the entry into the workforce and then you see the top levels being male dominant at this point in time. And I understand Ministry of Labor would have done some studies, but if we're looking at the data that we have, and considering that the public service is, a large employer, you have a real opportunity to lead the way in terms of how are we looking at our working spaces? Are we looking at discussions in terms of work schedules to allow for things like work from home opportunities and whatnot? That may then, while it may not be a gender consideration, but if you allow for the discussion to take part in terms of equitable access, you will widen the space for discussion. So that's why I asked to what extent is gender consideration or the unique needs of the particular genders in terms of beyond maternity leave, in terms of childcare, and how are we creating a future world of work that considers that half of the workforce have this opportunity or space where you may be out of the workspace for different reasons, but we can still create an equitable and enabling environment, as the public service. So that's the nexus for my questioning here.
Ministry of Public Administration.
Chair, I'm not sure that there was a specific question posed. I think the member was really making a position and clarifying the basis of her initial question.
Correct. And if indeed there would be, coming from the Ministry of Labor or even the Office of the Prime Minister, if it is that there is a discussion somewhere happening that looks at how are we looking at innovative ways of treating with the world of work to create, gender parity over or an equitable environment in the world of work overall. I think it would be useful for somebody to come in to say if that's a discussion, because I think if our discussion is centered simply around the statistics in terms of remuneration and whatnot, and not how do we get to an equitable environment, what are the things we're looking at, what is driving our policy decisions, what is driving our thinking overall, I think we won't actually see the results we're hoping for.
Thank you, Member. Member Ford has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Morning again to Trinidad and Tobago, the listening public, and to all our colleagues from the various agencies represented. Mr. Chairman, I would like to go to a comment that was made by the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Public, the PS of the Ministry of Public Administration, where he identified used the term different genders. And then my colleague, the Member of Parliament for Tabakit, just mentioned beyond gender, inverted commas, and then also gender parity. I would like to pose this question. Again, it will probably start with Equal Opportunities Commission, but then we could go on to the other entities in order to get a feedback on it. And I would like to go to the definition of gender. All right, and under the EOC feedback that we got from them, the EOC raised the issue of a definition for the term gender, and it's under the EOC submission, page 7. It was noted that there were different definitions for the term gender, and that's in inverted commas, in national policy documents, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago 2009 Draft National Policy on Gender and Development, And again, that's on the EOC submission, page 8, paragraph 2. In this document, gender was defined broadly in terms of social and cultural norms. However, in the latest edition, the 2018 Green Paper, National Policy on Gender and Development, gender was defined in biological terms, specifically as two sexes, male and female. EOC submission, page 9, paragraph 2, for easy reference. It therefore seems that Trinidad and Tobago's position is that sex and gender can be used interchangeably. And that's according to the EOC submission. So my question is, what is the EOC's view? And again, we can get the view from the other ministries and the other entities mentioned there on the definition of gender used in the 2018 draft National Policy on Gender and Development. So we'll start it there and then we can see where the discussion leads us, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I may respond through you, the gender itself is a term that's capable of a very wide definition. In fact, in the University of the West Indies, there's a whole department, the IGDS, the Institute of Gender and Development Studies. So speaking about gender is something you have academics at UE who write papers and publish books on that. What exactly does it mean? Gender is different in traditional literature. Gender is different to biological sex. Biological sex speaks to whether you're a man or whether you're a woman, and to that extent, doctors have their biological markers that they look to determine whether a person is male or female. Sex speaks to male or female, but gender speaks to masculine or feminine. So, for example, the doctors would look at your hormonal profile, your sexual and reproductive organs, these sort of things. That what you will say in a medical textbook, this defines whether you are male or whether you're female. However, so that's what sex means. Sorry, sex means biological sex. Gender is supposed to, in traditional literature, is supposed to refer to concepts beyond that, such as, so that's why in gender they use the words masculine and feminine, and gender in the traditional literature really refers to social and cultural constructs. So a classic example is that you may say that a shirt is masculine, but a blouse is feminine. Now, there's nothing inherently biological to say that a shirt is masculine or a blouse is feminine. This is just simply the social and cultural construct that you have as to what defines. So you will say that, this is masculine clothing, this is feminine clothing. Now, and gender also has extended to include areas such as sexual identity or sexual preferences. So it's a very wide area, and what we had found really is that the 2008 definition, while it is closer to the traditional literature, or the 2009 policy definition, while it's closer to the traditional literature, it might have proved a bit, for want of a better word, maybe controversial in our society, that maybe our society is not at a point where we're ready to deal with these issues. In fact, when one looks at the Equal Opportunity Act, it says, the Equal Opportunity Act specifically says that sex does not include sexual orientation or sexual preference. And this was a definition that was inserted when the act was being debated in Parliament in the year 1999 or 2000. Now, technically speaking, if we hold on to the definition that sex is purely biological and does not consider things like sexual orientation, sexual identity, gender identity, then technically speaking, that amendment or that insertion was not necessary, because sex discrimination really speaks of differential treatment between men and women. We touched on that earlier. Is a woman being paid more or less? Is a woman being paid less for doing the same job? What are the promotional prospects of a woman as opposed to a man in certain fields? That is really what sex discrimination is about. And I also gave the example, on the other hand, is a man being subjected to extra terms or extra conditions than a woman is being subjected to. A classic example one may talk about, just to throw out something for consideration, where in many of our legislation, to join protective services, we are told that a man must be X centimeters in height, but a woman can be of a different height. So that in itself is a form of sex discrimination. Again, it's just something to think about for general knowledge. so I think what had happened is that the 2008 definition really might have been a bit far-reaching or controversial at that point in time. So that to take the member from Tunapuna's very insightful point, the 2018 definition and our 2018 Green Paper really sort of equated gender to basically biological sex. I believe, and this is just my personal opinion, that at this point, as they say, there's a saying, sorry, you need to crawl before you walk. And it may be that at this point in our country's development, this is perhaps the more appropriate way to go at this point in time, until perhaps we are at a stage where we can perhaps embrace wider concepts. And if I may just stick a pin, I don't want to get into any political situation, but if one were to look at what happened in the United States, sometimes going too far with gender issues can have a backlash, as if we were to believe that perhaps the result of the recent US elections might have represented, among many other things, perhaps a backlash on what you call the woke culture. You know, that maybe one side was considered as being too far woke, so that they supported another side. Well, there may be many other reasons that have led to the results of the US elections, and I don't think we want to get into all of these, but we can say that at least one of the takeaways is that perhaps going, you know, there's a saying in the US, go woke, go broke. So and we saw that with for example, certain brands that try to advertise using woke messages, and there was a backlash against them. So the short point is that it may be that what we have in 2018, while it is not the most progressive way of dealing with it, might be the more appropriate way at this point, until perhaps at a later stage we might be in a better position to tackle those more complex issues.
Again, Mr. Chairman, again, thanks for that comment. It will be interesting to get the feedback from the OPM office, from the public administration, in terms of the clarity, because I think, Mr. Chairman, it's an issue in terms of, you know, that clarity need to be concise. It needs to be crystal clear as to, because we are dealing with gender in the workplace, and remember our objective, which is clearly along the lines of remuneration, conditions of work, promotion, safety, and health. So therefore, gender needs to be clearly identified in order for us to know exactly whether we can be able to achieve these objectives or not. So it will be interesting to hear, you know, I mean, again, just, you know, what's based on the policy statement, so identify what in going forward, you know, where can we look forward with regards to being clear on that. Thank you.
Member Ford, allow me just to piggyback off of your question, and
sure.
I would like to direct that question to the OPM.
Okay.
On their opinion or their stance on the matter, if it is that there's a green paper out, if there's a reclassification and that type of, or is there any intention to?
Fair enough, Mr. Chairman. I'll be guided.
Good morning to the committee and to the general public viewing. Yes, based on to support a bit of what the EOC was saying, there are two different definitions of gender in the 2009 and 2018. And the 2018 version definition was based on an older definition from the Rome Statute of the International Court, Article 7, Paragraph 3, which indicates that gender refers to the two sexes, male and female, within the context of society. Just to broaden that explanation of gender, the definition also goes on to specify that in most societies, there are differentials and inequalities between male and female, or men and women, and therefore the responsibilities, the access to control of resources are sometimes affected or are affected by these matters, including decision making. So gender determines basically what is expected and allowed, and that is based on sometimes whether you are male or female. So, for example, sex in Trinidad, male and females may do different things than persons, male and female, in another country. So, just to give an example, the Aka tribe in the Congo, women are responsible for hunting and going out there and getting the food, etc. Whereas in Trinidad and Tobago, in the Caribbean context, hunters are dominantly male. So it is linked to sex, but it's wider in terms of what responsibilities, what roles, and what is expected across society, and that differs between place to place, culture to culture, country to country. Even in Trinidad and Tobago, there's one culture in Trinidad across one country and Tobago, so it differs. As it respects to clarifying or closing down on the definition of gender, it is being reviewed by the Office of the Prime Minister. A review will be conducted and expanded consultations with stakeholders as requested by Cabinet so that these matters can be addressed going forward in the policy.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, but again, up to you, Chairman. You can be guided.
You go right ahead. You continue with your question as well. Member Ford.
No, you see, Mr. Chairman, my questioning was just based on the response that was given by the EOC. And based on the EOC response, because remember the EOC is an independent body, and I just wanted to hear from the ministerial point of view of if it is that they are what? I wouldn't want to say in support of what the EOC definition is or what the draft paper of 2008 versus 2018. You know, I just wanted to get a clarity so that we can be clear going forward, even though we have not made no definitive process, you know, from a parliamentary standpoint as to, you know, whether as we know gender to be as growing up, you know what I mean, versus what the EOC may have mentioned in their statement and in the two particular draft papers, Mr. Chairman.
Noted. I would like to go back to the Ministry of Labour. Yeah. Your submission has advised that it is in the process of developing employment standard legislation, which will seek to establish terms and conditions of employment with international standards of the ILO. What are the reasons for the delay in amending the current legislation? And is there a draft which is expected to be completed?
Good day, Chair. There's no existing employment standards piece of legislation. So this is actually a new piece of legislation that will be implemented upon Cabinet approving these policy prescriptions.
When you're going about the draft, can you identify the stakeholders who will be consulted during the development of the legislation?
In terms of the ministry, typically, with all areas of legislation, we always have multi-party stakeholders. So extensive consultation is done with trade unions, employer groups, other governmental agencies, international bodies like the ILO, the UN, etc., NGOs even. So we try to cast a very wide net in terms of all of our consultative processes. And you also add that the Industrial Relations Advisory Committee is also multi-partite. So there are representatives from the government, from the human resource profession, trade unions, representatives from the different employer organizations as well as academia.
Thank you. Sticking with the Ministry of Labour, civil service job vacancy census for the period of October to December 2020. Back to the study. The data reveal disparities in the average earnings between male and female workers across different employee categories. This was your submission. Of note is a pay gap between clerical support workers in both established positions and contract persons, where the pay disparity was 20% in favor of male employees. Further, the data revealed that the pay gap for service and sales workers was 3% higher in contract positions, 16% relative to the established officers, Can the Ministry of Labour indicate the reason for this variance in remuneration, noting that there is an established salary scale in the public service for such positions?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, I would like to reiterate that the Ministry of Labour is looking at the unadjusted gender wage gap. So therefore, if the value favors men, it suggests that the occupational classification is dominated by men. And if it favors women, it suggests that the occupational classification is dominated by women. For example, if you look at managers for the established office, it favors women. That suggests that at the managerial level, there are mostly women employed. That if you look at the permanent secretaries in the civil service, they are mostly females. Therefore, the wages attracted to that position will suggest that the gender wage gap favors women.
So you're suggesting it's not a real variance. You're just saying it exists because of comparison, because of a classification, or
right. So the unadjusted gender wage gap, look at the differences in average pay between men and women. If you take the average in salary between men and women, it will suggest that if it favors women, women attracts a higher salary, not necessarily because they are in the same position as men and earning higher income, but because the occupational group is dominated by women. Therefore, the average will favor women.
You know,
Yeah, so Chair, if I may.
Please go ahead.
So it's a participation rate that we are looking at as well, so that if it depends on how many persons are in the sector that we're looking at, and whether it's dominated by males or females, so that the average will change based on how many persons of one particular gender is in the group, so that it's not a real gender wage gap. It's simply statistics.
Right.
Average.
So let me just be a little devil's advocate, play the role, and right after that I'll go on to Member Haynes. What we're trying to achieve, if I'm not mistaken, is equal pay for equal work. And we're looking at a level of competency and being able to deliver at a job level, regardless of where someone is, and the disparity between male and female there. But to actually revert and say, it seems so because of the cohort that we are looking at, really and truly looks upon it like as a realistic or historical perspective, as opposed to creating parity via policy. I'm not hearing that, and I must ask the question that if it is, we are saying, okay, fine, that's a male-dominated job across there, and this is a female-dominated job across here. So it's okay for the non-leading gender to receive less remuneration. I think we are spinning top in mud because we're looking at a job description, a job role, and a job function and competent service. I'm not getting I'm not getting that from the Ministry of Labour at the moment. Can you clarify how you intend to proceed? Because if it is we proceed based upon how we have the data, we are not reclassifying anything and we're not looking towards change in any way. We're basically taking the old data, utilizing it as a justification of framing ourselves moving forward as opposed to a level playing field.
So, Chair, thank you. So, as I would have indicated before, terms and conditions are not under the purview of the Ministry of Labour. While that is so, it depends on the job itself, the job function. So that is what determines pay. So it's not determined by whether or not it is male dominated or female dominated. It's determined by the job itself.
I believe the OPM wants to say something.
Through you, Chair, I'd like to provide some additional context to the discussion. I think thus far we are looking at the issue in a very black or white way, and it is far more complex than that. So what the Ministry of Labour is describing as a situation of occupational segregation. So within one occupational grouping, there may be several positions. And these positions are occupied by persons of different sexes. Yeah? So it may have 10 at one level. Let's say it have 10 levels in that one occupational group. The numbers within there determines the overall, whether there's an overall gap. The pay associated with each role, each position in that occupational category is the same for male and female. It may vary within a particular range. So let's say you come in as a clerk and don't have all the prerequisites to be a clerk. You may start at the lowest point in that range and work your way up to the highest point in that range. Yeah? But it doesn't mean that someone as a clerk in the public service, if you are female, you receive a lower pay than if you are male. So I want that to be crystal clear in our minds. I also would like to speak to the point of the public service as the single largest employer, and the numbers as it reflects in the CSO's data in terms of the employment of male and females. So in the labor force, approximately 30% of all women and men, women who has the status of employed and unemployed. So you're in the labor force, and the labor force is employed plus unemployed. They are employed in the public service. The comparable figure is 22% for men. So what I'm saying, on average, the public service, which includes the ministries, the statutory boards, all the various services, including the police service, the fire service, etc., etc. It is those dynamics that account for the overall gender wage gap that we may experience. A bigger factor as well is the whole issue of labor force participation and the trends as far as labor force participation. We would see from the numbers that the labor force participation overall is around 54% for both sexes. But it is considerably higher for males. It means males of working age participate more in terms of volume, but they also participate more in terms of the length of time they remain in the labor market. What we're seeing as well is that females enter the labor force late and they leave early. And this is why I formed the opinion that the whole issue of the gender wage gaps goes way beyond hiring practices. It is about the cultural practices in Trinidad. It is about opportunity and access is about who takes responsibility in the home for care and domestic responsibilities, different phases and seasons in the occupational life of men and women. So, for instance, in a typical home, it is common for women to stop work at a particular time and concentrate on caring for the offsprings, and this will cause disruptions in the earning pathways of women. Yeah, but is the overall cultural dynamic that determines that. Yeah, and that will be reflected in the participation rate. So I rest at this point, and seeing some hands up, I turn it back over to you, Chair.
Thanks for the clarification from the OPM there. So just to reiterate, it's much more complex than just gender. It has to do with length of service, which has to do with entrance time into service. And it also has to do with the entrance time being a cultural predisposition based upon time and length of service. So maybe when we are conducting surveys, and I just would like to bring this to the attention of the TTSCI, that one of your parameters, if it is that they're conducting a survey, as you said, you will be listening in on the conversation of how it is going, would definitely be when comparing that wage gap, if any, comparative service periods would have to be taken into consideration. Yeah. And that would definitely be eye-opener for all. I saw Mr. Ford's hand up and it's gone down now, so I'd recognize Member Haynes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Just coming off of that contribution from the Office of the Prime Minister, and I fully accept and agree with that. What we're discussing here is a topic that has a lot of nuance, and the cultural impact of our discussion is very important. So my question, as was earlier, to public admin, as well as the Ministry of Labour, etc. And at this point, I wanted to bring in as well JSC, because I thought their submission was particularly informative. Because the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we taking statistical data, so the numbers, right, and making certain applications without expanding our policy making to consider the things that we know to exist? So JSC, in their contribution, and I'd like Mr. Johnson or Ms. Tommy to come in here as well, raised a number of issues in terms of looking at male-dominated services and female-dominated services, and what the packages which were not subject to negotiation included. And so whether or not you had greater access in terms of government housing and what that means for you beyond an earning potential, but what it means in terms of stability and things that you can accomplish in life. What were the entry requirements into spaces that are more female dominated, and what that meant in terms of the compensation packages. And so that in our discussion here today, we first have to decide what we hope to accomplish, which is an equitable working environment, equitable access to opportunities, and that no specific sector is being left behind or overburdened, or that we aren't considering the differences, considering the nuances, and utilizing our spaces as policymakers to make a concerted effort to bridge a gap where a gap may exist. And so at the Equal Opportunities Commission raised a number of issues that they would get in terms of complaints and whatnot. Are we looking at those things and recognizing where there's a gap, and then using our policy making to bridge the gap? If we're not doing that, then we're not doing anything respectfully. We're collecting statistics on one hand. We may be analyzing the statistics, and then the policy making, comes not from the data, but from just, checking boxes. So I just raised with JSM now, I would like to give them the opportunity to discuss their submission and their understanding from the perspective of the employee, the workers, what obtains in the real world environment in Trinidad and Tobago as it stands.
Yes, thank you. And through the chair, thank you, Member of Parliament. I just wanted to invite my colleague at this time, Comrade Sharon Lacan, who would be able to share a bit of a perspective on this, especially where we're talking about not just the basic remuneration, because most areas covered by collective agreements, meaning and collective bargaining. Once you look at the salaries, etc., it will of course appear to be equal for men and women. I think what tends to happen is when you drill down further into some of the conditions, some of which are historical and do not necessarily find themselves embedded in the collective agreement. I think that is where we have challenges. As a quick example, before Sharon comes on, in many of our services or quasi like police, fire, etc., these were predominantly male. But of course, we are taking in segments of women in all of these services now. But if you go to several stations or dormitories, etc., you'll find that there's not provision of basic facilities that takes into account that you now have women in these services. So you have issues with change rooms where women have to, be exposed because they're using the same change rooms or certain facilities, etc. So these are some things that traditionally, and even in one or two areas where men may get an allowance on the account of being married, but women do not. So let me just quickly invite my colleague, Comrade Sharon Lacan, to speak a bit to some of these areas that she would be more familiar with. Thank you.
Good morning again, everyone. Thank you, Comrade Johnson. Thank you, Chair. Going into some of the disparities that were observed when you zoom out of each service and look at it on a macro level, you find that, as the member had pointed out, that there are several disparities in terms of the male-dominated compared with the female-dominated services. And in terms of the housing allotment, it is our understanding that housing allotments for the male-dominated services have already been set by Cabinet, whereas for female-dominated services, there's no, particularly for teachers and for nursing personnel and so, there's no housing allotment. And it is not subject to negotiation through the collective bargaining process. So that is one area. And as somebody had mentioned earlier, in terms of the responsibilities for home care and the care of children and elderly relatives, it rests disproportionately on the females rather than the males. So in addition to their paid jobs, women are disproportionately the ones to absorb unpaid work, and in particular at home involving child care, care of their elderly relatives, and so, compared to men. In this regard, it has been observed that female-dominated essential services, which comprise numerous single parents, mothers, do not receive the additional allowances or housing allotments that would assist them with providing for their families and securing their offspring and so. That's just one area. And when we look at somebody had mentioned the educational requirements to enter the services. We have, for instance, a female-dominated service, the nursing profession, we have more and more persons are being qualified with a bachelor's degree. And teachers are also pretty much female or dominated. A bachelor's degree is the entry level compared to the male dominated, like let's say for instance in police, they require 5 CXC O-level subjects. For the prisons, 3 CXC O-level subjects. For fire officers, 3 CXC O-level subjects to enter their service, the male-dominated service. The time period for training is also different. For instance, in the female-dominated nursing service, we have 3 to 4 years training to become a nurse. For teachers as well, same 4 years training. Whereas for our male-dominated services, it's more or less 6 months training to enter the service. And when we look at comparative salaries, it's different. So whereas the beginning salary may be a little bit lower for the male dominated compared to the female dominated, their progressive salaries moving up ranks, it's higher. So let's take for instance, we have a nurse, a registered nurse, starting salary. At the present, we use the public service salary scales. So a nurse enters the service at range 32 with a minimum starting salary of 7,774 compared to a police officer, constable would start at 6,702. A station officer in the fire. Oh no, sorry. A firefighter at 6,700.
Ms. Lakan, are you comparing across industries or you're comparing male to female within the same industry?
Comparing across industries, male-dominated industries in the essential services compared to the female-dominated services in the essential services. Respectfully.
Sure, proceed. I was just missing the differentiation.
Mr. Chairman.
My apologies.
Mr. Chairman, just before we move on.
Go ahead, Mr. Ford.
Before we move on, again, I know we are getting some good information there, but we will not be able to get all the statistics that the member is providing. So I don't know if you did that. Again, she can highlight 1 or 2 important ones, and if it could be provided, it could be provided to the secretariat. You know, the whole comparison, the logistic, the reality, and the whole statistical information that she's using there could be provided to us in writing.
Noted. Ms. Lakan, just proceed, but just make your point succinct as possible when it comes to the comparison between the entry points, please.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this document, I believe, would have been submitted along with our other submission. But just to pull out another point in terms of facilities, as Comrade and in the male-dominated, as Comrade Johnson would have indicated, because they are now having to accommodate female officers entering those services, facilities for women, for female officers it still leaves something to be desired. Another instance, apart from these services, essential services, when we look at the other categories of workers in the society, for instance, CPAP workers, it has been the observation that when they are out on the field, there is no toilet facilities. Of course, the males among them, while it is not legal, may prop against a tree or something to relieve themselves. Whereas for a female in the worker gang, if that may be the appropriate term, does not have that luxury to have a little privacy to relieve themselves. It doesn't have toilet facilities unless they probably knock on a nearby villager's home for that sort of convenience. So I don't want to belabor it much further. Of course, the documents could be made available with our comparison. So thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Ms. Lahan. My next question is to the AOC. In 2020 to 2024, January to February, women filed twice as many sexual discrimination complaints as men. Can the EOC provide information on which sectors these complaints originated? And is there a particular sector where you found the majority of complaints coming forward?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Most of the complaints, come in the sphere of employment. We're empowered to receive complaints in 4 areas. That is employment, education, the provision of goods and services, and the provision of accommodation. But according to our statistics, almost every year, more than 80% of our complaints come in the sphere of employment. So that these would be persons who were claiming discrimination on the grounds of sex in the employment in some way or the other. Now, some of these complaints, for example, involved allegations of both sex and something else. So there were. So although we say that we would have, let's just say, received 61 complaints in total from over the period, it's not only. Some of these complaints are not only purely sex discrimination. Sometimes, for whatever reason, when a person is ticking off the complaint box, they tick off a number of things. So part of our job is to investigate and to perhaps inquire into it some more and see what complaints may have some merit and what complaints may not. A number of these complaints sometimes get resolved over the period. For example, but we did point to one complaint, for example, where someone said that they were terminated from their employment on the grounds of being pregnant, and discrimination against a pregnant woman is considered sex-based discrimination. The thinking is that only a woman can become pregnant. Again, never mind what we hear coming out of the United States. We still hold on to the belief that only a biological woman can become pregnant, so therefore only a woman can suffer sex-based discrimination. So some of these complaints would, for example, involve discrimination against pregnant women. Some of these complaints would involve sexual harassment, which is a form of sex-based discrimination. Although it was not covered in the period, we did mention that we had received 2 complaints of where women were saying that they were paid less than men. Most of these complaints were in the private sector. What we had found, and I believe other members of the committee had made the same point, in the public sector where remuneration is standardized by the CPO or where there's a collective bargaining process, you tend to find that there isn't much gender pay disparity between men and women. Certainly not in any ministry or in any government department of the central government. If there is a disparity, it may be accounted for by other factors, such as maybe one is senior to the other, so they get a higher level of increments, or maybe there's some traveling attached to the position so that they get a traveling allowance or something like that. But it's not really a case of, at least certainly not in the public sector, we have not found any, we have not found a significant or any sort of gender pay gap in the public sector. If it does exist, it probably exists more in the private sector. But again, we have not been inundated with complaints of persons in the private sector saying that this has happened. I don't know if it might just be that persons are reluctant to come forward, because in order to lodge a complaint, in order for us to address the issue, you have to lodge a formal complaint. And if you lodge a formal complaint, then we have to write or contact the employer and say so-and-so has lodged a complaint. So it's not possible for, I'm just saying, you to lodge a complaint and then we to investigate without informing the employer, look, so-and-so has made these allegations against you. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if that answers the question or if you want more information.
No, something that leads into it. Given in the Caribbean context, culturally, as it relates to the reluctance of males to file complaints, especially of sexual harassment.
Yes.
What has or is the EOC doing to educate and encourage males to file complaints or encourage males to file complaints of sexual harassment? And is there also an awareness program that there is an outreach of understanding what the public can utilize the EOC for?
Yes, in the past, we had a robust public education program where we went, where we would go into different organizations or different groups and do what you call a presentation as to who we are and what we do and what are our specific areas that we can address. We had in fact developed a specific presentation on sexual harassment, so that we have that specific area that we have developed a presentation on. At present, our corporate communications function is a bit hampered because we do not have a manager of corporate communications or a corporate communications officer. So right now we are in the process of recruitment, and I think that has hampered significantly our outreach program into those areas. We have not done a specific program on male sexual harassment. We simply do a program on sexual harassment generally, but in that program, we explain that, for example, sexual harassment is not just a male boss harassing a female person. There are different types of sexual harassment. There's what you call, there can be vertical, there's horizontal, where there's a power relationship. For example, if a person has as your boss, they have power over you, then that would be considered vertical sexual harassment. But there's nothing about. But we have explained at length in our programs that sexual harassment is not just a male harassing a female. It could be a female harassing a male, or it could be same-sex sexual harassment, a male harassing a male or a female harassing a female. So while we did not have a specific program geared to that, we do include that as part of our general program.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the answer. Not seeing anyone hands up anymore, but sticking on the same topic, I would like to bring this questioning across the JTUB. Based upon your membership and the many sectors that you represent and put representation for, has there been, or do you have a system? And if so, has there been an increase or uptick or recognition of these type of level of harassments, male to female, female to male, and how is it dealt with by a category and severity and so on, if any?
Okay, thanks, Chairman, for that question. Just to respond, JTUM itself as a federation, as an umbrella federation, would not deal specifically with individual complaints, but our member affiliate unions, of course, each union would be representative of various categories of workers and sectors, and they would be the ones that would interact with the employer in terms of dealing with that. However, on a broad level, we will from time to time, get reports in terms of how that is being dealt with. And one of the things we have always recommended, and it is, I think, practiced by most of the affiliate unions, is that to ensure within the collective bargaining spectrum or collective, the collective agreement rather, that there is a provision or clause that specifically outlines a process as to how sexual harassment is dealt with in the workplace, so that there's a specific process that the worker can follow, an individual can follow if they have a complaint, if they feel they're being subject to some kind of harassment, vertical, horizontal, or otherwise. So in most collective agreements now, you would find that there's such a provision. If it's not in the collective agreement expressly, then usually we would find it would be, we insist that it be incorporated in the HR policy of the respective organization. So that specifically is how that is dealt with. And just to touch on, even with where it parallels or somewhat gender-based violence, which unfortunately affects women at present much more than men in terms of being victims. We have also been advocating for there to be specific policies or clauses in collective agreement to protect women, because sometimes sexual harassment morphs into gender-based violence, except, sometimes there's really a thin line with that. And therefore, we insist that there must be provisions in the workplace, whether in the collective agreement or via policy, by which these incidents can be treated and an effective resolution arrived at.
Staying with
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Member Ford.
Based on the information we would have just gotten from JTOM, it would be interesting to know from, again, public administration or labor, in terms of in the public service, policies on sexual harassment, whether it's across the board, whether each ministry has their own, whether we don't have any, what we have, what we don't have. It would be interesting if we could get some little feedback on that, or again, provided in writing based on the time that we may have.
Absolutely, and thank you, Member. I open it to first Ministry of Labour and then Public Administration, that particular question.
Thank you, Chair. At the Ministry of Labour, in 2024, we launched and implemented a national workplace policy on sexual harassment. We started it in 2019 with that, but a launch went on in 2024. We've had public awareness campaigns targeting employers and employees, explaining what sexual harassment is for both male and female. And we also launched a helpline. The number is 800-CAAD. And that helpline is facilitated in Spanish, French, and English. Right? And work is being undertaken in terms of legislation to govern sexual harassment in the workplace.
Stay with the ministry before we move on to public administration. How is your outreach and your awareness program, and what measures have you taken to engage as much as the public and you work in public as much as possible?
Upon the launch of the National Workplace Policy last year, members of staff of the Ministry of Labour have gone to several private and public sector organizations to facilitate workshops and inform them on the national policy and their responsibilities within that policy. I do not have exact numbers. I could submit that in writing to the committee.
Moving on to, thank you. Moving on to Ministry of Public Administration.
Before you move on, Chairman, I just have one point. Seeing that it's the Ministry of Labour, is it that all other ministries will supply their sexual harassment cases to the Ministry of Labour, or each one is independent? Before you move on to the next ministry. Thanks.
Yes, once there is a claim of sexual harassment in a particular ministry, department, agency, once it goes through the process within the ministry and it is not dealt with, it goes to the Ministry of Labour for continued escalation.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So,
Ministry of Public Administration.
Thank you, Chair. The ministry acknowledges the remit and the role that the Ministry of Labour plays with respect to the national policy with regard to sexual harassment in the workplace, and we and the rest of the public service are guided by their provisions. That notwithstanding, as a public service, we would frown upon any acts of sexual harassment in the workplace, whether carried out by males towards females or females towards males or within the same sex. There are existing provisions for the reporting of any unwanted or unwarranted acts by either party towards the other, which can be treated via the respective disciplinary procedures that have been developed by the Public Service Commission. Where necessary, there is the avenue for a report to the police service where those matters can be treated. But generally, there are existing provisions by the relevant agencies for treating instances of sexual harassment.
Thank you very much. Staying with Ministry of Public Administration, the submission from the OPM stated that Trinidad and Tobago's current legal framework presents a disparity in parental leave entitlements with respect to maternity and paternity leave under the Maternity Protection Act 4557. Maternity leave under the law is 14 weeks. This is a minimum standard recognized by the ILO, while paternity leave granted to male employees is 4 days. Given that in other countries in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica, which currently has 20 days paid paternity leave, and Barbados, which is seeking to amend paternity legislation, paternity has been granted for fathers for up to 20 days in those areas, in those jurisdictions. Does the ministry intend to propose amendments to legislation to include paternity leave for fathers for periods similar to those adopted in other Caribbean countries?
Chair, while we recognize and acknowledge the practices in other jurisdictions, not only within the Caribbean region, but even internationally, to give greater attention to paternity leave and the benefits that brings to the family and the upbringing of the children, I don't think it's the remit of the Ministry of Public Administration to address that particular issue. I think in the first instance, it may fall to the Ministry of Labour. It is certainly an issue that could become a 2-month condition of employment, which would fall to the Personnel Department and the CPO, as well as the various representative worker unions for discussion and agreement.
Thank you very much. Any other questions by members? So can I shift that question to the Office of the Prime and the OPM concerning any recommendations based upon paternity leave and any amendments moving forward, or the Ministry of Labour?
Through your chair, the paternity leave issue, I think, requires a joint approach between Ministry of Labour, Public Administration, and the Gender Division. At the end of the day, there is a financial consideration to it that has to also be taken into account. So I think that is something that will require some further and deeper consultation.
I would like to just get his thoughts on that from Mr. Johnson, the umbrella company and the umbrella organization, JTAM.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Just to indicate that the JTAM and the labor movement as a whole, we do recognize as a progressive So as we move to become a progressive society, that this is something that is definitely needed, and we have made recommendations wherever possible in various quarters for this consideration as something that should be really very urgent to be addressed. So what is happening whilst we're waiting on let's say a national engagement of this in some collective agreements. We have been in the private sector, especially, we have been able to engage employers to, of course, in most collective agreements, you would find that there's a provision for paternity leave, but it's usually restricted to 3 to 5 days. But in recent times, we have been engaging employers, and we have been successful in a few employers to extend the period for paternity leave, in one case for up to 20 days. But this really requires a national approach, and we look forward to that and would certainly support that.
Recognizing some hands that are up. Member Ford, followed by the Ministry of Labour.
Yeah, I just want to add also in terms of the paternity leave, which again will be along the lines of the maternity leave, which is for the female, right? That whether it is paid or unpaid, paid means you will receive your full salary, but with the ladies, maternity leave, if it's unpaid, you would then qualify for a maternity benefit through the national insurance system. So again, Mr. Chairman, those would be some of the considerations, whether on a national level or on just, as Mr. Johnson just said, on the private level, some of the things we'll need to consider, whether it would be paid or unpaid, or whether it is, again, we'll move from the 4 days, under 5 days to 20 days, or as the case may be. So that's part of the consideration we need to look at. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
So Ministry of Labour, taking that point into consideration and the question at hand.
Yes, good day, Chair. With respect to the Maternity Protection Act, the Ministry of Labour engaged in a national stakeholder consultation in September 2021 with respect to the amendment of the Act. The Ministry received several comments and feedback from a lot of stakeholders, which was then made into a report, and a policy position paper was then developed. That policy position paper was approved by the Minister of Labour and submitted to Cabinet as at September 2024. Now, one of some of the amendments suggested within that policy position paper do include paternity leave, as well as parental leave, as well as breastfeeding breaks. Thank you, Chair.
Many thanks. Any other members have any other questions at this point in time? Well, at this point in time, I would like to have some brief closing comments in the following order. From the Permanent Secretary of the Office of the Prime Minister, followed by the PS of the Ministry of Labour, followed by PS of Ministry of Public Administration, and then EOC, JTOM, and then TTCSI.
Thank you, Chair. The Office of the Prime Minister recognizes that there are persistent gender wage gaps across Trinidad and Tobago, and the OPM really does support a call for a comprehensive study and review to uncover and address both the varied factors underlying these inequalities in both the public and the private sector. The OPM, however, wishes to also state that the issue is an extremely complex one, and the existence of the gender pay gaps is a combination of structural, social, economic factors. These include occupational segregation, unequal access to opportunities, unpaid care and domestic responsibilities, part-time work, discrimination, and interruptions in career progression. The OPM stands ready to work with the members of the committee and to our partner ministries and departments to aid in any kind of study to this extent. So we hope that we can improve the system. Thank you very much.
Ministry of Labour.
Thank you, Chair. The Ministry of Labour thanks the Joint Select Committee for the opportunity to participate in and gain valuable information from today's deliberations. The Ministry remains committed to fulfilling its mandate of providing decent work to all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. We also recognize the importance of gender parity and continue to engage in dialogue with our social partners in this regard. The Ministry therefore looks forward for any recommendations of the committee as we work toward achieving these goals. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the member from the EOC for closing comments.
Yes, thank you, Chairman, and members of the committee for including us. I think I could have called for perhaps some greater research into this area. I would always, however, just stick a note of caution that we have to be careful. Again, as the honourable member from Tunapuna pointed out, we need to at least start with a working definition. What do we mean by gender? Are we looking at the differential pay gap between men and women? And then at the same time, are we looking at it from a general perspective? I recall the technical officer from the Ministry of Labour saying, well, you look at what men are receiving and what women are receiving, and then you say there's a gap. Or are you looking at it in terms of comparing like with like? Just to illustrate, I remember reading something from some international organization that was making a case that there's a gender pay gap, for example, in the airline industry, but they were saying that men tend to be employed as pilots, whereas women tend to be employed as stewardesses, and pilots are paid more than stewardesses. And while that may be a fact in a general sense, you really can't compare the pilot and the stewardesses. So in other words, we need to make sure that one, we have our definition of what do we mean by gender, and then how do we define this pay gap? Because we can't really, it's not a realistic comparison to say that there's a pay gap because the pilot is being paid more than the stewardesses. And thank you, and we look forward to working with the committee and all other stakeholders in advancing this area.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramkaran Singh. Mr. Johnson from JITM.
Yes, JITM is thankful to have been included in this this session today, and we look forward to in terms of however we can assist. We are conscious in terms of some of the areas that were identified today: remuneration, conditions of work, etc., safe and healthy work environment. These are things that we have to deal with, or our affiliate unions have to deal with, issues that arise in all of these areas on a daily basis, and of course in the process of collective bargaining. So this is something that we would certainly like to see in terms of the outcomes. We also hopeful that as we go forward in terms of, for example, ILO conventions and recommendations, to see perhaps a more robust approach by Trinidad and Tobago as a country, the government, in terms of our ratification of conventions, which will certainly assist in some of these areas. So we are hopeful to see that going forward, and we thank you for including us in this consultation today. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Johnson. I would like to ask Ms. Diane Joseph for her closing comments.
Thank you, Chair. The TTCSI would like to record our appreciation for being in this session this morning. I think it has been very informative, and it is going to lend support to the new survey that we plan to engage in very shortly after this exercise. Let me say as well that we plan to circulate this to a wider audience with a longer time frame for responses following review of the submissions that we can have access to following the session today, and also consultation with our key stakeholders within the industry. So thank you once again for having the TTCS.
Thank you, Ms. Joseph. I'd like to, as Chairman, thank all contributions today from all stakeholders. I would also like to thank members for their attendance to this hearing, staff of the Office of the Parliament for their consistent and support and logistical support as well, and the viewing and listening audience. I wish you guys all and listening public a safe and happy weekend, and thank you very much for attending the session today. Goodbye. Declare this meeting closed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.